Okay, looks like we're live on YouTube. Hi, everyone out there on YouTube. I'm Sean Kidney. My friend here is the fabulous Nicholas Robbins.
My name is Nick Robbins. Welcome.
Sorry, having a little bit of a challenge this time of the day. But thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be started soon.
Sean, are we going to read from the little book of green finance jokes as well?
Well, hey, if you've got one, I really want it. Quickly, get it.
I know.
you know, Nick, that could be our next publishing project.
I think so. 1st of April next year. I think we've got to do it.
Oh God, I haven't put out an April Fool's Day media release for ages. The last one I did was an announcement that the Prince of Wales was launching a green bond for his Duchy of Cornwall investments, and someone from the Prince of Wales office phoned me up and said, "Is it true? Really?"
It's very good. There's a very good way of prodding people into doing things. Very good.
Alas, he's not yet issued a green bond for all that, but whatever. It made a news story in the FT, I think, as a straight news story.
Very good. Very good. And we need a few spoofs.
We do. Not enough humour in this game.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, sometimes there's not a lot of reason for humour, but nevertheless.
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
So were you following the G7?
Not really. I'm halfway through this communique. Have you read it through? It looks. I mean, it hasn't got a very rousing success response, I don't think.
It's actually quite okay. I believe they cut out, a friend of mine was helping draft it.
Yeah.
I believe they cut out a couple of things at the last minute, like a coal fund.
Right.
Mainly because Senator Manchin in West Virginia wouldn't have accepted it and trying to get his vote for the infrastructure fund at the moment. So not quite there. And it does read a bit dry, but when you look at it, there's a reasonable amount of good stuff in there, I think.
Yeah.
I've had people complain that climate is way down the agenda after health and all this, but I don't mind that.
Well, come on, we have got a global pandemic. I mean, it's kind of
exactly.
I think the thing is just this is a very good pitch if actually we didn't have the same the time pressure. I think that's the problem, isn't it?
Correct. The time pressure is the issue. I mean, at least the Biden summit had a lot of 2030 announcements, which was a big win because it focused everyone on the time frame, which I think is what we have to do.
Yeah.
From now on.
No, I think so. Yeah, no, because I think we have the paradox now that almost we may be sort of thinking too much about 2050.
I think 2050 is kind of a waste of time, personally. People say, hang on, we're going to need 9 years to get going. Actually, we have to get going now, because if we're not there in 9 years where we need to be in 9 years, we're toast.
Yeah. Well, I was really struck, by the IA's recent report on emerging markets. I don't know if you saw that. I mean, they sort of kind of buried it, but you need sort of a 7-fold increase in annual investment in clean energy by 2030. So this is sharp, yeah?
It is sharp. It is sharp, Nick, and that is the main game.
Yeah.
How we do that. On the other hand, at least, we've got some inkling. Some government, like the German government, are starting to offer blanket guarantees for green in Southern Africa and stuff like that. So the elephants are moving.
Okay.
But they can't find enough to invest in.
Yes, that's the real problem, isn't it?
Well, it's the conversation we used to have about India.
Well, it's a conversation everywhere. It's the same in the UK. There's sort of the missing middle is the sort of, you've got the sort of the ideas on the ground and then the money in the financial centres, but actually nothing to connect the two.
Which is a good problem to have, right? At least it's a better problem we had 5 years ago.
That's true. That's true. We had nothing on the ground and no money.
That's right. So, Safa, you'll tell us when we want to get started. I'm assuming there are people on YouTube listening into our chatter at this stage. Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
All good.
It's very interesting, the conversation, but I'm looking forward to it a bit later in the event. Well, I'll just do the usual introduction right now. So welcome, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well, and thank you for joining us. My name is Safa Lukili. I'm the events director of the Oxford Climate Society and a master's student in environmental management here at Oxford. Our society aims to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our School of Climate Change, which taught over 1,500 people from all over the world last term. We also run the world's largest student-led climate journal, The Anthroposphere, and are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies. So today's event will discuss how to unlock and enable private capital to help finance climate adaptation and mitigation projects. The need for specific climate financing was recognized in the Paris Agreement, which calls for making finance flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. According to the IPCC, an annual investment of $2.4 trillion is needed in the energy sector alone until 2035 to limit temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. Another $1.8 trillion is needed to establish or enhance climate resilience. And so in the past decade, climate change somehow emerged or gained significance in the financial sector through the growing disclosure requirements, the rise of the anti-fossil fuel divestment movement, and the growth of the green bond market, as well as labeled financial asset types such as transition bonds or sustainability-linked bonds. And so, nevertheless, climate finance continues to fall short of documented needs, and it relies heavily on public capital. Now, with public budgets constrained by urgent spending on the COVID-19 crisis, private investment in climate action seems more than ever critical. But barriers remained, from high upfront costs of renewable energy projects to perceived low returns on investment, to the lack of information service and technical support, for example. And so channeling private finance for climate actions is an ongoing challenge. To discuss potential solutions moving forward, we are delighted to welcome two experts in the field, Sean Kidney and Professor Nick Robbins. Sean is the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative, an international NGO working to mobilize global capital for climate action. Besides leading the CBI, Sean serves as a member of the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, and has worked as a consultant on green bonds with the United Nations Secretary General. Nick leads the Sustainable Finance research at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. And the focus of his work is on how to mobilize finance for climate action in ways that support a just transition, promoting the role of central banks and regulators. Nick is also the co-founder of Carbon Tracker, and from 2014 to 2018, he has worked with UNEP's inquiry into sustainable finance system, where he established the Sustainable Insurance Forum. And so to start the event, I will now hand over to Sean for his 15-minute speech. Please go ahead, Sean.
Thanks, Safa. So I'm going to get going on some general remarks. Nick's going to make some remarks, and then we'll have a free-for-all, see where we get to. So I want to talk about barriers and opportunities to you listening into this, which is not something I normally talk about with our finance sector or government audiences. I'm going to say that the barriers to change that are adequate with what we have to actually do are not unusual to change topics we have to do. They're about sectional interests. We have a habit in our society of looking at silos of work and looking at short-termism, short-term indicators of success in that work, and not joining up all the issues. It takes a crisis or a prescient leader, as occasionally pops along, to start looking at bigger pictures. We're not very good at them, oddly enough. It's a bit like if you're in your kitchen on Zoom all day, as I am at the moment, you focus very much on the screen in front of you or getting lunch or whatever. And every so often you have to break out and think, oh my God, there's a whole world we've got to address here. Because of course, that's exactly what we find ourselves in, a situation which we have not encountered as a species before. that what we've done to the planet, a sign of our success as a species on this planet, is extraordinary in terms of the damage we've created to the atmosphere or delivered to the atmosphere, to other species, to biodiversity, to ecosystems, while we've managed to create a very comfortable nest, relatively comfortable nest for many of us. Not all of us, by any stretch of the imagination. There are still many of us that are having a damn tough time out there. But we have created a world in the West, in Japan, and even in Eastern China now, where material wealth is extraordinary compared to what it was 200 years ago. The average life expectancy in Shanghai and in London is now in the 80s. In 1900, the average life expectancy in London was 40. Just that statistic alone gives you a clue of what we've done for the human species, but we've done it in a way where we've created some rather major problems. When we start looking at the problems that we've created, we begin to realize that we have to start dealing with them on a planetary level. We're talking about the atmosphere. We're talking about oceans, let alone, of course, the challenges of biodiversity, which are global, not just regional. Unfortunately, the way we organize our lives, our societies, our economies, is a bit like the way I generally organize my kitchen on a day-by-day basis. It's caught into silos and short-term approaches. And as a result, we have a body politic because we have not yet come together properly as a species across the planet. We have a body politic which is made up of individual sectional interests all fighting it out for their interest, based around their key performance indicators, such as executives in companies that may have only a 3-year or at best a 5-year horizon to make change. And these all butt up against each other. And our DNA is built for famine times when everything's there, you go for it and you grab what you can. And so our companies are, and so our societies are, and so on. And as a result, we have a horrible problem. The climate. Of course, there are other aspects about that too. For some of us, I'm going to put Nick and myself in that basket. We've abandoned politics. We've let the idiots get in charge. We decided to pursue other careers that didn't look for various reasons to work out for us. And we find ourselves in a situation of crisis. And let's not mistake what we find ourselves in. It's a crisis with people in charge who are often not up to the job. They don't read. They don't listen. They don't understand science. And I'm not just talking about the Trumps and the Bolsonaros of the world. I'm talking at the bulk of leaders. I can remember having a conversation with the executive director of the International Energy Agency some 8 years ago at a conference in Turkey. And he said to me, I said to him, what do you think? Do we have a chance? And he said to me, I don't know that we do. We're talking about climate. I don't know that we ever do because I don't think the world's leaders are up to it. We found ourselves in a situation where we've handed the tiller of society to people who unfortunately aren't up to the job too often. Now, of course, we find ways around that, but we've constructed a society also which is prey to short-termism, which is prey to electoral promises and lies at elections and different ways in a democratic politic, which is unsuited to the kind of crisis we find ourselves in. Let me talk about that crisis. We are in the midst of an existential challenge to our place on the planet. We have created the environment where we're not sure whether we can survive as a species. On current trajectories, assuming we don't change as we all hope we will, assuming it stays the same as the last 30 years, we will see greenhouse gases of 1,000 ppm by the end of this century. It's currently 416 or so. The highest it has ever been now, highest it's ever been while humans have been alive on this planet. We have never experienced this before. The temperature range on the planet while humans have been on this planet has stabilized around a band of 1 degree above, 1 degree below a median for millions of years. We are in the process of jumping that 6 to 8 degrees above median. We do not know. We have no experience. There is no history of humans living in that kind of environment, let alone an air that is as rich in greenhouse gases as we stand now. We don't know. If we do survive, it'll be thanks to mutation. It won't be thanks to the DNA that we currently, or genetics we currently have now. We're an adaptable species like cockroaches. We probably will find a way to survive. But I'm going to tell you one thing is certain. If we continue on the path we're on now, there is no way our current civilization, all the pros and the cons, can survive. We will see drastic change. We are likely to see the loss of billions of people on this planet by the end of the century. When I speak to my friends who are senior climate scientists, they say they're not sure there will be a human species by the end of this century. They are very depressed about the future for their grandchildren. There's an epidemic of depression amongst climate scientists, in case you didn't know, because they've been telling us this for 30 years. It is not new. The first discussions of climate science were in 1856 by a woman scientist who came up with this thesis about the warming of the earth, and we're just continually proving it again and again. Al Gore in the 1970s heard inquiries in Congress about this. It is not new. It is old news. We are just failing to act. Now, I have to say this, because unless we understand the crisis we're going into, we cannot understand what it is that we must do. We have to have a visceral understanding of the risk we are taking with the future for our children. Well, actually, the future for ourselves, given the speed of change that's happening, given the news that came out only a few short weeks ago about the drying up of the Amazon and now the increased likelihood it'll turn to savanna in the next 10 years, not in the next 50 years, about the extent to which the Arctic is likely to lose its sea cover in summer. And what you may not realise is the extent that means that we then warm up the Arctic and release vast quantities of greenhouse gases that are currently frozen under the Arctic, like a shot of adrenaline into the world's climate. And we lose it, we lose it, we lose it, we lose any chance to control, to manage, to stabilise, to live in a world that has given us who we are, to live in a world that has managed to keep temperatures, Gaia has managed to keep temperatures at roughly 1 degree range beyond the mean for the millions of years we've been on the planet in various formulations of the human species. Somehow or other, we find ourselves in a position where we're about to reckon. So that's the bad news. The good news, well, there's a little bit of good news. We kind of know what to do. It's not rocket science. There's been so much damn science about this over the last 30 years. There are blueprints upon blueprints upon blueprints. We know, we know, we know. It is, yes, about changing how we manage our land. It is, yes, about putting 15% of the oceans at least to marine reserves. No fishing, nada. So fish stocks can recover, like we've done of whales, but so very few other species. It is like putting large slabs of the earth aside as wilderness areas, so the species that currently only make up 6% of mammal biomass on the planet, wild species, we've managed to cut it down to that level, have a chance of regrowing, have a chance of giving us the diversity that has allowed us to flourish on this planet. And of course, it's a matter of getting emissions down, getting rid of emissions fast, killing coal, excuse the language, but doing the same with fossil fuels. No, it is too late for gases transition because we cannot afford any new emissions. Reference the IEA's net zero report of a couple of weeks ago along those lines. We know what to do. We know that we can invest, that we can do this with capital. Most of what we have to do is about building different kind of kit, changing kit, building new kit that will allow us to leave more land as wilderness, etc. Of course, it's vast, as you would expect from an existential challenge to our species. but we know what to do, and we have the capital. At this time on the planet, we have more capital, as Nick knows, than ever before in the history of humankind. And large slabs of that capital are sitting in places like negative interest rate bonds in Japan, in Germany, in Sweden, in Switzerland, not earning a zack for your pension or your insurance fund. We need to put that capital to work. We can put that capital to work. And it's not going to be put to work largely in rich countries. It's going to be in emerging markets. At least 70%, if not more, of the capital that we need to invest to create a low carbon, resilient, and fair world has to go in emerging markets. It has to go to places like Lagos and Nairobi and Mumbai and Jakarta. We can do this. You know, we built our economies, the economy of the UK, the economy of the US, the economy of Japan, by mobilizing capital and directing it for public policy purposes. We built bridges, we built railways, we were clever. In the US, since the 1790s, we've been using credit guarantees by the state to ensure that capital goes in the right direction based on what public policy required, sometimes in ugly ways. But the point is, there were public policy decisions made to shift capital. We know how to do it. There is no new thinking or science required. It is simply looking under the very carpet we're standing on for the solutions. That's the good news. We have some wins. Post-pandemic, we do have a narrative becoming dominant of building back better, as the Biden administration used in its election slogan, as the G7 has used with its communique in the last couple of days, as many governments from Europe to China are now using. We do have, thanks to a change of government in the US, an extraordinary consistency of 2030, which is the horizon to worry about, not 2050, 2030 commitments to reduce emissions. Are they good enough? They're pretty good. They should be better. They should be tougher, but it's a damn sight better than it was 2 years ago when we had 2 countries committing to 2050 net zero. Now we have 112, and all the major economies are committing to really tough 2030 targets. That's a win. Let's count that as a win. Let's help them, because none of them know how to do it. None of them have aggressive enough industrial and climate and environment and finance policies to achieve those targets. None. But they're asking. Good on them. They're asking. We can help them. We've shown, going back to capital, we can shift that capital if we need to. The thing I've been working on for many years is a green bonds market. It's $1.4 trillion now outstanding. It's a big figure. I thought it'd take a while to get to $1 trillion, but we got to $1 trillion. It's taken longer than I needed. We need to be there 5 years. Let's be clear, 5 years ago. But at least we're there. Capital will flow. Capital wants to flow. It needs deals. It's not finding deals that are green. What we need to do is help now create those deals around the world. We have regulatory engagement in Europe. I've been working on a taxonomy, which is a science-based guidance for what you're allowed to call sustainable, which every bank, investor, and corporate will need to report on each year. Now, that is what we need everywhere. That's one thing we need everywhere. Make it easy to know what to do and make sure it's tied to the Paris Agreement and science. And then preference everything, guarantees, other kinds of support. We'll go into that with Nick later. And then finally, imagine the future. Now, I say that advisedly. In 1980, the Chinese government started investing aggressively in creating a future that now exists on the east coast of China, building modern cities, building infrastructure. They lent to paddy fields. They lent to things that were mirages, and it worked. It created an economy. Now, they made some bad mistakes because they didn't understand the environmental considerations, but the point is correct. At this stage, in this extraordinary moment of crisis, what we must do, what we urgently need to do, not just in Paris and London, but also in Sao Paulo and Accra, is imagine the world that needs to be, not that we want, that's part of it, but let's think about it as needs to be. Green, low carbon, climate resilient, and build it. And build it with all this capital sitting around in the pockets of the German state and the Japanese state. We can do that. We can do that even in the 9 years we have before our deadline hits 2030. We can do it because we've shown we can do it in the past. We've built whole economies in rapid time in Japan, in the US, and in China in extraordinary short periods. That's what we've got to do. I call it a green window. We have a green window till 2030 to act. We don't have longer than 2030 until we start just finishing off the job. We have to act in the next few years. So if you're at Oxford and you're thinking about a career, think about what kind of world you want to live in and think about your role in creating it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. And thank you for finishing on a hopeful note. I was very worried at the beginning. Oh my God, we are doomed. But yes, I think it's true as a young person as well. It feels like we're very much in a transition where our silo, kind of short-sighted vision of our economy and then the environment is on the side, and we have to think about it after as a second thought is moving, is becoming more and more obsolete. And we have discussions about circular economy, distributive economy, industrial symbiosis, and all this innovative thinking that we were not really hoping for, let's say, just 10 years ago. So thank you for that note. And now I'll hand over to you, Jimmy. Please go ahead. You are muted.
I am. Thank you. Thank you so much, Shafar, for inviting me to join, and thank you for allowing me to follow Sean. I suppose I'm not just allowed to say I agree with Sean and shut up. I'll say something a bit more. So just to introduce myself, I've been actually working on green sustainable finance for about 30 years, and so a long time. And so maybe one thing to take away from what Sean has been saying, very rightly highlighting the really catastrophic challenge we face, is the time horizon. So really what we need to do is in the next 10 years. So maybe think in terms of your own life, however old you may be. And it's a sort of, it's 10 years ago and 10 years forward is what we need to be really thinking about. So maybe let's think about finance and the financial system. We have enough money. We have $370 trillion in the global financial system. We have, certainly on climate, a very clear goal to make, no sort of doubt about that, to make financial flows, all those financial flows consistent with a net zero economy and with climate resilient economy and development. So that's the task ahead of us. We've got a 370 trillion in assets around the world. The great thing is, and this is different from what it was 10 years ago, is the vast bulk of those assets are now controlled by central banks and regulators who have recognized climate risk, and are held by banks and investors who now recognize climate issues. So I think we've got to a stage where many of the key players in the organization have recognized the need for change. We have also signals of things actually moving, as Sean said. We have a trillion and more in the green bonds market, but we're still in probably single digits in terms of green aligned assets. So out of that 370 trillion. So we've still got a long way to go. But the good thing is that actually we now have that sense of commitment. So some of the things I think we need to be thinking about. I mean, when I was listening to Sean, I was really trying to think about this in terms of 3 places in the world, which I'm sort of focusing on at the moment. One is Yorkshire in my country in the UK, a former sort of coal region, the most carbon intensive in the country, where there's a lot of focus on how to raise finance for the green industrial revolution, and what that means in terms of offshore wind, what that means in retrofitting every home in the community, what that means in tooling up every SME, what that means in terms of every hospital and public agency. So that's one place. And again, a sense of a legacy of what has been the consequences of a mismanaged transition away from coal and heavy industry that happened in the 1980s and 1990s. So this importance of the just transition, but a huge bottom-up demand. And there, the issues that seem to be emerging are very clearly a sense of demand on the ground from communities, from local government, from businesses and so on, but a real difficulty to get access to capital, particularly from, let's say, the City of London, a sense of this disconnect between the demand for capital on one side and the supply of capital from banks and investors who are increasingly wanting to deploy it. So I think that question seems to be the major piece. How do we create this pipeline, and how do we connect the demand for finance with the supply? Not least because we now have most of the banks, say in the UK, the leading investors are all committed to make this journey, and we need to increase that rate of net zero investment in the UK by fivefold this decade. So very, very quickly. Another place, Mpumalanga, coal province in South Africa. South Africa again, very clearly wanting to make a transition away from coal, recognizing the risks to its national economic viability from a continued reliance on coal. A huge potential for renewables, lots of desire to move into renewables, but again, a real question about how do we ensure that we green the economy, that we ensure that South Africa is resilient to the impacts of climate change, particularly its agricultural sector. But what do we do about this particular area where there's already 40% plus unemployment, where coal again is a source of income and employment for those livelihoods? So how do we ensure that this transit, we're not just moving away and exiting coal and so on, which is obviously what we have to, but creating those new jobs in renewables and sustainable infrastructure. And then the third place in India, in Jharkhand, in the eastern part of India, again, a part of the coal state. Huge opportunities for India if we move away from fossil fuels in terms of reducing air pollution, which kills more than 1 million people a year, in terms of reducing imports of fossil fuels from overseas, channeling investment into people's development. But again, that's the question that seems to be coming up again and again, is how do we connect the financiers who are based in Mumbai with the communities, the enterprises and so on in this mining area who want to move away, who need to move away from coal, want those new enterprises and so on. So I think that's the sort of big challenge, is one of connection between the demand for green finance, the supply of green finance, and particularly sort of connecting the financial community, the financial professionals, so they are really at service of real communities, real businesses around the world. So maybe if we can sort of set out, and Sean touched on many of these, set out maybe a sort of a hit list for how we can overcome some of the barriers that Samar, you sort of said you wanted to talk about. So there's no doubt about the need of the scale of the capital, the speed of capital, actually the desire from providers of capital, banks and investors. They want to do this. So that's all good. But what are the levers? What's the hit list of levers that we can pull? So maybe in the discussion we can talk about some of these. So maybe first is the role of the guardians of the financial system, the central banks, the financial regulators and so on, Bank of England or People's Bank of China or whatever central bank you're operating, the Fed in the US. How should they be moving from essentially a sort of recognizing that climate change and climate risk is a potential threat in the future, to being more assertive in the way they oversee the financial system and become sort of net zero central banks? So this becomes, so net zero and this goal becomes the goal around which they organize their regulation of firms, their governance of monetary policy, and so on. We see, again, some interesting positive signs, certainly in the UK, starting to review the way the Bank of England purchases bonds, so that climate factors are included, starting to include climate into the way they're regulating firms, stress tests, scenarios, and so on. So a lot of movement, which is extraordinary to see, given the last, where we were 5 years ago, but actually probably again a step shift in terms of what needs to happen. So that's a first set of actors, and what do we need to see in terms of that community? Moved a long way, but how far do we need to move in the next 5 years? Alongside that are the finance ministries, the people who set financial policy, particularly who set taxes, carbon taxes and other taxes, set the fiscal regimes, the incentives, the incentive regimes for renewables, the way in which they can provide risk guarantees within their countries, between countries, and also those are the agencies which particularly will provide the capital for the crucial agencies which are development banks. The development banks are really the institutions who move the financial frontier, who are charged really with helping to create that new economy, to build those pipelines, to walk sort of hand in hand with the more cautious banks and pension funds. So another group, and we have a coalition of finance ministers now thinking about and acting indeed about climate change. And one of the things they are starting to do is make disclosure by financial firms mandatory. So actually the information comes out into the public domain. So we have the central banks and so on, 70 or so of them now committed, the financial ministers. But I think, again, to pick up sort of Sean's theme, many of these, I think, are still seeing climate change perhaps at the edge of their portfolio, rather than as the sort of driving feature in the way they think about tax and spend. So that's maybe the sort of the public policy arena. Then we have the financial sector itself. We now have $70 trillion who have committed in the Glasgow Finance Alliance for net zero. So again, no lack of commitment from banks, from pension funds, from asset managers, and so on. But I think the issue we're still finding is that the shift, the reallocation away from high carbon assets, coal, oil, gas, and others, and also sort of destructive deforestation into green assets is not going at the speed we need. So what is needed? We have these commitments to 2050, net zero by 2050, 30 years away or so. But what needs to happen in terms of the sort of business plans and the lending portfolios and the investment portfolios of every bank, of every investment institution over the next 3-5 years? In that time horizon, what are the actual reallocations of capital that are going to be needed there? And the key piece, I think, as well, is what are the skills that these, particularly banks, what are the skills they need to support their customers and clients through this process? How are they going to support individual households in retrofitting their buildings? How are they going to support SMEs in terms of upgrading their production capacity and their logistics fleets? And how are they going to support communities? So I think it's both a question of the capital and risk and so on, but it's hugely a question of the skills and motivations and behaviors that these financial sector institutions have. So sort of first group is the public finance people, the central banks and finance ministers. The second group, the financial institutions. But the group that is often left out of this debate about green finance is actually consumers and society. Civil society has been incredibly important in terms of setting expectations and prompting movement, both by financial institutions and by financial regulators. But I think in all the discussions I have around green finance, very, very little discussion is actually focused on the needs of individual consumers or clients. And I think that's where we really do need to get far more attention to really understand how people can get access to the finance they need. Often there are issues there about real access to finance, particularly in developing countries. But also how can sort of support and advice be given for different types of customers? And I think these people, this is a big gap. So as I said, we have a huge commitment now. We've got to move this 370 trillion at speed and at scale. We have many of the mechanisms we need to put in place in the capital markets, in the banking sector and so on. The regulators are also signed up. I think the challenge, which hopefully we can pick out in the discussion, is what are the steps to accelerate this so that when we meet again in 2026, all of us have helped to move trillions towards this net zero future. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. I just had a question on what you were saying about the reallocation of capital from hard carbon assets to green ones. So we've seen that fossil fuel companies such as ExxonMobil have actually been purchasing debt to pay their dividend to their shareholders, and dividends from green assets are much lower than the ones from, for example, fossil fuel. And so there's this kind of perception that shareholders are waiting until 2035 to sell the assets, and like this kind of temporality is problematic. Is this something that do you agree with this characterization, or and how to kind of shift that?
I think one of the things is the huge inertia in the financial system, and often it's just sheer laziness. But people, particularly investors, invest according to benchmarks. Increasingly, investments are done in a passive way, so you don't actually choose what proportion of assets you have in a company. And if you do manage according to benchmarks, people tend to stay very, very close to the benchmark norm. I think the characterization you gave may have been accurate perhaps 5 or 10 years ago, but I think we have examples. So we have an example in Europe, for example, of the Danish oil and natural gas company, Dong, which has moved and is now renamed itself and has moved to being essentially an offshore company. So it's gone through that whole question. It's been the chameleon that's moved out of fossil fuels. One of the last times I looked at the share price, it now has a market cap that is larger than BP, which obviously has been making some steps, but has not decided that it's going to move at that same speed and scale. So the signal that you gave, Safar, that actually Exxon is borrowing to pay dividends shows just how desperate their situation is. It's a desperate situation that you borrow to pay dividends. I mean, any investor should be horrified that that's the case. You pay dividends out of long-term profits. You do not pay dividends out of debt. That is a way to perdition and collapse. So I think it's a signal, perhaps, that actually maybe companies like that are trying to maintain the appearance that they're still profitable. But if that is the case, then they're clearly actually borrowing rather to invest, borrowing to pay dividends, which is a real sign of a business model out of sync with reality, both financial and environmental. So I think one of the challenges we face, which is why I think we both focused on this sort of 3 to 5 year horizon, is that is the window in which we would be expecting banks and investors to be making substantial shifts in terms of their capital allocation. And the 2050 is by when the last emission, the last ton has to be emitted, and before that. But the investment to achieve that has to happen long before. Yeah, you need to invest before you abate. And so in the UK, at least, the peak level of net zero investment is 2035. So this is the focus, I think. But Sean, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and handing back to you, Safar.
Please go on, Sean.
I was simply going to say that latency is an issue we don't understand enough, or at least at a decision maker level. You know, we have lost the first half of the fight against climate change. There's a 30-year latency effect. The emissions we put in 30 years ago are what are warming the planet this year. So, as you have seen from all the data, warming is very much happening around the world and leading to climate change already. So this is like last century's emissions. The emissions we put in this year will contribute to warming in 30 years' time. In other words, in 2050. So if we want to actually get emissions down after 2050, we kind of have to start tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. It's that kind of crazy thing about latency effect, because after all, we are talking about a very large, very complex system with a lot of components to it. And this is just not understood by so many people. Now, what we're on now is a race to avoid catastrophic change in the second half of the century, which is why we have to start tomorrow morning, because of the 30-year timeline. We also have to understand that for the next 30 years, we are going to continually feel the impact of emissions from the last 30 years where, by the way, we put in more emissions in the atmosphere than in the previous 150 years. So we didn't do very well in the last 30 years. And prepare, because it's going to be a volatile century where, lunatic weather is the norm from now on, and a variety of other things. Sea level rise, we ain't seen nothing yet, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got to prepare for that. That's climate resilience. And one thing the pandemic teaches us is climate resilience is just not physical infrastructure, because the pandemic is as a result of degraded ecosystems, which are linked to climate change and the loss of biodiversity. Bats clustering in colonies in Southeast Asia because they were forced out of their old colonies, etc. By the disruptions we have created, we have set off this chain of pathogens jumping between species. And hey, surprise, the World Health, I should say the IPCC's Health Committee has been predicting this for the last 30 years, that we're going to get a century of pandemics. So we need to treat this one as the first. And when we think about how to prepare for the future, and by the way, all the epidemiologists will tell you this, we need to now understand, Christ, we've got to learn some lessons quickly. Yes, we've got to have PPE manufacturing in England. Actually, Nick, we had it in England, they just didn't use it, but that's another story of competence. Nevertheless, we need to make sure we know where it is on tap, and we can get it. We need to make sure that we have free healthcare in the US, because when janitors and cleaners and other poorly paid workers can't get free healthcare and don't get any social protection like a wage when they're sick, they will keep working. Understandably, they've got to feed their kids and they'll spread the disease. And that's exactly what happened in March of last year in the US, and happened in many other economies like in Brazil, which has led to runaway pandemic. These need to be understood as climate resilience measures, not just dealing with a one-off crisis. We have to prepare our societies to be able to manage this kind of volatility, which will be the norm of this century. And if we manage it well, we will end up like Taiwan or Australia or Korea. If we manage it badly, we will end up like Brazil or the US or the UK. That's it. We have a stark version of the two alternatives in front of us now. I don't know how many of you know, but in Australia, where I spent the first 4 months this year for a variety of reasons, there is no COVID. If they get one case, it makes the newspapers. Everything shuts down. It is extraordinary. People living their lives. It just shows you it's like a parallel reality. It's like one of those science fiction books, an alternative universe, because of the measures that were taken. And we've got to understand this, that there are choices. They're real choices. And choice A will mean a lot more people die. And choice B will be a lot fewer people. People will still die, a lot fewer people. And that applies to climate resilience, pandemics, and to the climate. The choices we make now will determine how many people are going to die in the second half of the century, essentially.
Thank you, Sean. On this point of climate resilience and climate adaptation, there seems to be, in particular in climate adaptation, a gap in the amount of climate finance, but also in particular finance from private investors. I think it was like 1.6% of the climate adaptation finance coming from private capital in 2018, and huge gaps in Latin America and the Caribbean and Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And one of the reasons, I suppose, that companies or private investors invest in climate adaptation, unlike climate mitigation, is to enhance the resilience of their supply chain. But we still see that there isn't much improvement in that area. Do you think this is because of a lack of awareness due to lack, for example, of like country-specific information on vulnerability? Or do you think it's just a lack of...
Very few people know what to do.
Okay.
Very few people know what to do. And they certainly don't know how much they have to do. Where they're thinking, oh, we just got to build up the seawater at the beach. I'm afraid it's not enough. I mean, there are people doing good work. Some of the transport bodies that run rail in richer countries, not in poorer countries, have managed to get consultants in and done a good job of figuring out how the rail infrastructure is going to be swamped over the next 20, 30 years and how they can take steps now to avoid it being affected. Stuff like that is happening, but it's small. In the property sector, which is the biggest sector that's going to be impacted, hardly anything's happening in a proper way at a city level, because people are afraid to tell people who own waterfront homes that their property is going to be toast in 20 years, which is what's going to happen. Miami will be underwater by 2050. Won't be as habitable as it is now for the problems of having porous rock underneath. You can't build a seawall, etc., etc. These are hard things that we can start addressing now. The capital will flow if we can make it clear what qualifies. As when we occasionally do, the money flows. I can tell you that where we've seen water bonds issued by water utilities for resilience investments, there's been no difference in the demand for those bonds to mitigation bonds. Absolutely fantastic. Or sovereigns, when Netherlands did a sovereign green bond to finance adaptation measures on the coast, it went like hotcakes. So from an investor perspective, they just need confidence that it's the right kind of investment. And governments need to know what the right kind of investment is, because generally they're looking 3 years out, they're not looking 30 years out, and so on and so on. So yes, education, understanding is a critical part of it. There's no doubt about it. We'll get there on the adaptation and resilience. The bulk of emerging market green finance in the next 30 years will actually be adaptation and resilience. There's a huge mitigation agenda, mainly around urban development and some land use measures, but it'll be adaptation and resilience, because that's the stretch of the world which is going to be seriously affected. I mean, but to give you an example of why we need to understand properly, at the moment, we are going to have to abandon large swathes of the tropical world by 2050. We need to understand that before we start building resilience investments there. As I said when I spoke to regulators in the UAE recently, they need to understand that in summer, they're going to be getting 60-degree days for weeks on end, which will change the tensile resilience of the tall buildings they have there. They need to start building shopping centres underground, where they can cool them more easily than being above ground and exposed to much more heat volatility, because it won't be possible to maintain the structural fabric of towers in a climate where you're seeing 60 degrees Celsius days for many days on end with the current building materials they've got. So that's a planning issue, which they're not doing yet, by the way. That's a planning issue that a lot of parts of the world are going to have to tackle. Our real challenge is that some of the areas that climate scientists are telling us are likely to have to be abandoned currently have a lot of people in them, like a lot. And, in the Mekong Delta, where we now are already seeing salination starting up, but salination by 2050 is likely to overwhelm the bulk of the Delta. How do we maintain that population? And where do they go exactly? Like, is there anywhere they can go? Or Bangladesh or northern India, where we expect to see significant incidence of wet bulb temperature when the humidity and dry heat becomes so high that people only have 3 hours to live, which we don't really see now, but is expected to be common by 2050 in tropical zones. So you can see potentially tens of millions of people dying in one of these incidents in places like Uttar Pradesh, where there is no real support for it. So we've got to prepare for this. That is about built environment and making sure it can stand extreme heat. It is about, sure, air conditioning, but there's efficient ways we can do it by like going underground. You suddenly realize, oh my God, this agenda is big. Okay, if you're a financier, the opportunities are fantastic. If we can construct this and with the right kind of planning, ban bad activities and make sure that the right licenses are given, if you build a zero carbon, super efficient building, you can get an extra 4 stories height or maybe 4 stories underground. You get permissions like that to pay for the extra difference. We can do this, but we've got to bring in those planning laws like pronto because of the latency. And this is what we've got to understand. Latency is a big issue here.
Thank you, Sean. Nick, would you like to share your opinion on this as well?
Yeah, no, I think the way you introduced it, Savah, was really interesting, actually. And I think in many ways, it really focuses on who is best placed to act on some of these issues, to manage these risks and to deploy capital. And I think, so in many ways, we know from an economics point of view, let's say the issue of building retrofit, and a bit, I mean, I'll come to resilience as well, but we know that economically it makes sense for building retrofit to go ahead, and yet it doesn't happen because there's so many other so-called agency problems, design problems, and also we're putting the burden of taking decisions on the back of an amateur, the householder, who is not financially expert. It's not easy to find a one-stop shop for this. And so we have market paralysis. And so essentially we need to think about who is best placed to respond to some of these challenges. So that is why I think you need to move upstream, thinking about making sure that not that a green mortgage in that case would not be sort of a nice premium option when you're thinking about financing a house, but it becomes a core part that during the lifetime of that mortgage, that house becomes resilient and net zero. And similarly for resilience, in a sense, particularly in developing countries where there are immediate issues around which people need to focus. There is a shortage of access to capital. There are often very high costs of capital, and maybe time horizons are relatively short, where you don't have that expertise and you don't know exactly what future you're supposed to be making your business or your community resilient against, then you're going to, again, be paralyzed, I think. And I think so many of these issues are collective action issues that I think particularly with resilience, you are looking to governments, to development banks and so on, to be taking a lead and then supporting and showing where there are other actors, particularly in individuals and businesses, how they can then follow. So I think that's one of the things we're learning as we move into this sort of new economic regime, that actually a pure market response, which relies on individual response, doesn't always work. Markets are brilliant things, but in this case, just relying on amateur people with actually weak access to capital to take all the decisions for us, I think is perhaps a bit unfair, and also it hasn't worked so far. It's unlikely to work in the future. So I think much more focus on this, these sort of system solutions that we need to take.
Thank you so much. Just on the point that you were talking about the price of the cost of capital in developing countries, and how there's also like a perceived lower rate of return from investors, especially from Western countries, like investing in Sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And one instrument that has been like gathering a lot of enthusiasm in the literature is blended finance. So using concessional like finance to kind of leverage private capital and to reduce risk. And I was wondering what your opinion was on this, because there seems to be a lot of organizational but also cultural kind of barriers to that mechanism to take on importance in development finance. So yeah.
Blended finance is just the public sector taking on some risk. And there's 1,000,001 ways you can do it. It is the way we have built our societies. Let's be clear about that. Where we have mobilized private capital. The railways of the US were a form of blended finance, where in that case, the government gave away land concessions to the railway companies who built property developments on towns, shooting a few Indians in the way to get them out of the way, which built 3 railways across the US. That's a kind of blended finance too. But what people generally mean of blended finance is, which is not strictly speaking correct, is funds where there's a bit of public sector money with some kind of structure where, let's say, development bank takes risk. Development banks are themselves blended finance institutions if they're done well. I mean, there are 500 development banks in the world, and only about 4 or 5 do any kind of leverage of getting in private capital behind public capital. In other words, clever use of public capital, which is a great opportunity because there's another 495 around the world that we could convert with a bit of work to be more efficient managers or mobilizers of capital using blended finance tools. So absolutely. Look, it's kind of simple, right? If you want the Suez Canal in Sinai, you can send in the army and build it, or you can give it really cheap capital. So you make sure build it with all the consequent benefits to your economy. The latter is the path we're looking at. If we want Lagos to be low emission, then we need to be able to give cheap capital for Lagos to build railways instead of freeways. Because at the moment, the capital costs work way against doing railways. So they build freeways because they're short term, same in Manila and so on. That's what the West, or rather the holders of low-cost capital, need to do. That's what the ambition of the Chinese Belt and Road was in its own way, except they haven't quite sorted out the green, but they are working on it. I'm going to tell you, there's a fight going on in China about that too. And that's what we need to do in the West. We have to stop looking at investments just locally and understand that our future lies with the people of Lagos. It lies with the people of Jakarta. And unless we make sure that they're able to choose a path that is clean and green and better for their kids, we will suffer in the same way as if we don't get poor people in the US free healthcare at the beginning of the pandemic will come back and bite all of us, including the economy, by the way. You know, at the last G7 meeting, there was a proposal to spend 50 billion by G7 countries on vaccine development, which would have saved $100 trillion of just loss of revenue from economic disruption. Like, it's not a hard argument when you put it that way, but we just fail to act because we're not aware adequately of both the positive and the risks if we don't act. But the point is, we do have a chance to act. And I would hope that next time there's a pandemic, we will bite that bullet and spend the 40 billion early to get the vaccines out faster, to stop fewer people dying and disruption in our economies. And exactly the same equation is what we have to look at with climate. And it's emerging markets that need the support. It's not Sweden, it's not Spain, it's Morocco, and so on and so on.
Yeah, and maybe to add, I mean, I think clearly this is a team sport, and I think what we've seen in terms of the creation of these new green markets, that the public sector does go first, and I think this is maybe one of the lessons of Mariana Mazzucato and so on, is that these are the institutions, the public sector, either through incentives, renewable incentives, or through development banks. These are the ones who actually see long term. Do take risk, and then do crowd in the private capital behind that, and that's the case. So the likes of the World Bank and the IFC, the IB, and so on, they are the market makers in that, which I think sometimes is difficult to understand, because we think that often it's the private sector that are innovating. And yes, there are many innovators, but the people who are doing the hard work is the public sector. So blended finance, yes, it needs to be the reality, particularly building these pipelines, so that the 100 trillion which is in pension funds around the world, which is for often low-income employees, how can that be put safely so they can have a decent retirement in emerging market infrastructure? How do we overcome those perception and real risk issues that you started so far? And also, how do we ensure that the blended finance isn't subsidizing excess profits from investors? Because obviously investors are looking for profits. And again, if the public sector has to put up capital to speed this process, how do we ensure, again, on the other side, that there are appropriate taxes on companies, which we're now seeing the G7. So it's if you're going to ask for blended finance, then clearly the capital for that has to come from somewhere. So one of the things we may want to think about is, do we need over time, for example, to reform all the tax incentives that we currently give for pensions, for savings and so on, which at the moment are not connected at all to climate change. So you can put money into a pension plan in most countries, let's say of the OECD, and there's no linkage at all. You're just getting public subsidy to grow your pensions, which is a great thing. That looks after the long term. But I think potentially that could be linked more to allocating some of that, for example, into developing countries, and making sure that that tax incentive was only going to funds which actually did have a credible pathway to net zero. Because at the moment, scarce public money in terms of tax incentives may be given to pension funds and others who actually are not taking the steps we need, and we shouldn't be sort of subsidizing inaction in this case. So that's maybe a way, or we could be sort of boosting this blended finance, but actually linking the incentives that investors already get more clearly to this capital reallocation piece?
I mean, there will be some challenges for emerging markets. I mean, we have this growing collaboration, way too small, but it is growing, between public sector agencies and private capital. And you see this in the leverage that you're getting from the IFC or the Inter-American Development Bank or EBRD, who are now working much harder to crowd public capital, private capital, I should say, behind them. So it's starting. Long-term capital, we're talking, as Nick said, pension funds and insurance funds. This is not really being very attractive for short-term capital. You know, the people who are shifting money on the stock exchange overnight, good luck to them. But the bulk of capital on the planet is actually invested by long-term capital holders. So that's good news for us. There will be some governance challenges. You know, when an investor like PGGM in the Netherlands, the BT Pension Fund in the UK, invests in somewhere like Kenya or Cote d'Ivoire, they will be looking for how to mitigate their risk. That's what the rich countries can do through development banks or whatever. They will need to be confident that that money is going to be paid back. There's some governance challenges. They will need to make sure or be confident the money is going to green and not being siphoned off into a Maserati dealership. There's a bunch of what you call monitoring and verification that will come with this. Now, if you're an emerging market, you can choose not to play. But your economy will probably suffer. And we can look around the world at countries that are already in that particular space. If you are willing to play with a clean green, you can get access to these kinds of incentives and these kinds of approaches. And that will be the trade-off. That will be the deal that has to be done. I mean, there's plenty of scope to push our public sector institutions, the World Banks, the IMFs, to be more progressive, to focus on just transition, which Nick has done so much work to talk about, rather than, I'm going to call it, old-fashioned economic ideas of transition and so on. There's plenty of work to improve it, but that will be the deal. Cheap capital to create a future you want to live in. And if you don't, it's not going to be as great for your society. You're going to have a tougher time. And we will get situations where one country is getting fast development in the way that it wants, and the country next door is not, which we already get in different parts of the world. Look at the difference between countries in East Africa at the moment that have chosen different kinds of development paths and governance paths. So that's going to happen. The only question is doing it in such a way as it's not oppressive, and it does address the issues about how we move workers, like the coal workers in South Africa, that have to lose their jobs, into a way they can keep earning a living. How do we make that a just transition? And so on. These are part of the deal. But it's doable. It's just that we need focus on it.
Thank you so much, Sean. Given the time, I think I will turn to audience questions now. One audience member is asking, what is your opinion on the local financial solution recently proposed by an Oxford research group to employ equity and risk-sharing arrangements rather than debt finance for nature-based solution deployment?
I haven't read it, so it's very hard to talk about it. But it was one thing that I wanted to touch on, which is maybe not what the person was talking about, which is about local finance. And I think, Safar, in the sort of introduction of this, we've been talking very globally, but I think also be thinking, I think one of the key gaps we have is actually raising funding for local transition activities. So we have the Oxford Low Carbon Hub, which has just been raising through a community share issue, I think £3 million. And I think we need to be thinking as well at that sort of level in terms of debt financing, equity financing, and so on. In the UK, where I think we're all sitting, for every 100,000 people, there are £3 billion pounds of investable assets. So again, there is sort of savings and investment available, but actually there are very few mechanisms to actually channel those into the communities that people live. So that's not I haven't read the paper that the person said, I haven't heard of it, but I think thinking about things which are place-based, whether you are in India or South Africa or in the UK, that is a key missing part, because our current financial system doesn't necessarily focus on that. So we need to think about the types of institutions, community finance development institutions, local funds, to enable people to invest in the transition in their communities, as well as on global markets.
Yeah, that goes back to what you were saying about SMEs and financing communities, obviously. Sean, do you
look? I don't know the comment too, but there's lots of room for innovation. There's 1,000,001 ways to do this, between equity, between risk sharing. Yes, of course, it's all about risk sharing. It's about how we pick up pieces of the risk that private sector investors, with the regulatory environment we've created them within, the fiduciary duties we give them, can't pick up or find it difficult to pick up. And so if we want to achieve change, and this is no different to if it's a 1942 in the US in a war, or climate now, or building the railways of England, you pick up a bit of the risk. You say, I'll find some way to pick up the risk. You give away land, you provide a guarantee. The US has always provided guarantees. In Europe, they've used different measures. They've had banks that have had public policy priorities, Landesbank in Germany, and in China, they had state capital allocated. So they simply said the China Development Bank and various other banks will lend based on what the government wants to build broadly. And then they've got to figure out the deals along the way. There's a dozen ways we can do it. So yes, great, an equity risk sharing project. It's part of the mix of solutions. Whether it will work will depend on the nature of risk sharing and whether it's adequate and whether we get support. All should be tried. We do need to let 1,000 flowers bloom at the moment. That's for sure. There are some things that I can tell you that are axioms and rules here. If we want to get things done that haven't been done before, whether that be vast land use renovation or improvement projects in Brazil, or whether it be green buildings in Lagos, we are going to need to deploy public sector support for them through development banks or guarantees or whatever it means. That's just an axiom. The instrument, whether it's equity or debt, not so important. Debt tends to be refinance rather than project finance anyway. So you need to have a capital stack, a bit of equity, a bit of bank lending, and a bit of debt. Think of it as a system. You can't just pick one and hope for the best. You're going to have to think about it as a couple of, these are just axioms. But within that, there's a lot of room for innovation.
Thank you so much. So there is another question on the coal and nuclear. So one audience member asked, how does conventional financial analysis of coal and nuclear financial returns compare to the same analysis of green energy technologies, such as tidal power, for example? Is this approach to analysis a barrier to mobilizing capital for climate action?
Well, I mean, I spent 7 years as a financial analyst. And I think one of the things is to recognize, particularly in the sectors we care about, energy, agriculture, transport, these are fundamentally shaped by public policy. And so, for example, in the UK, nuclear is, as we know, has a risk of catastrophic incidents. And so the insurance for that is paid for by the state, yeah? Because no insurance company will insure the risk of catastrophic incidents happening in nuclear reactors and so on. So I think if you look at where nuclear reactors are building, they're largely in China. You have some in the UK, but that requires large-scale investment from governments and public subsidy and so on. Coal, I think actually there the investment analysis has changed quite fundamentally. People are recognizing that is a sector on the way out, certainly in the OECD, and coal will need to be moved out of the power grid by 2030, and many countries have taken steps to that. So I think the analysis is shifted quite fundamentally in terms of coal, recognizing this it's a system on the way out. And I think what is interesting now is actually thinking about mechanisms, some are calling them coal retirement mechanisms or energy transition mechanisms, where, for example, when we're talking about developing countries with large installed fleets of coal, is how do we encourage the accelerated closure of these assets, whether coal mines, coal-fired power stations in India, South Africa, wherever, Clearly, those are providing power to these countries, and we need to find mechanisms so that the wind down can be accelerated. And also we have a just transition for the affected workers and communities. So I think, in a sense, I think certainly with coal, the issue has shifted to, one, clearly no new coal, but actually how do we encourage that accelerated phase out of coal? And that's where I actually see some of the bankers I talk about are now talking about new coal retirement mechanisms, not new coal investment mechanisms. Obviously, a few countries are still investing in coal, but I think that tap is going to turn off fairly soon.
I think it's also just something to say about the strength of state action. The reason all this is happening fundamentally is because two countries took really strong state action to grow renewables despite it being expensive. Germany, thank you, Green Party, in 2001 introduced the feed-in tariff. This is a revolutionary large-scale mobilization of capital, but more to the point, aggregation of demand for renewable energy, which drove the price down. And then a few years later, China undertook the largest commissioning effort around renewable energy in history, which led to the building up of production capacity in China with dramatically lower unit cost. So now, a few weeks ago, or last month, Saudi Arabia had a solar auction, which saw a 23% drop in the cost of solar from the previous year. 23%! And it's going to keep happening. From what we can see, a lecture that's online by Michael Green at New South Wales Solar Research Centre, we're going to see a 6-fold reduction in the price of solar between now and 2025, just in a few short years. This is what's making all these other options uneconomic, because two countries took major action to massively commission renewables when it was still expensive for other reasons, for reasons that were public policy reasons. And this same equation applies in areas like green hydrogen. If a few countries were massively to commission green hydrogen, the price would drop like a stone and no one's going to buy natural gas anymore. Gone foot, because there's an alternative that'll be cheaper. And I predict to you that it will be cheaper at least by 2030, which means it's game over for natural gas as a result. So the consequent effect is someone in Saudi Arabia just gets cheaper price. Someone in India just gets cheaper price. In Australia, rooftop solar has been the story of the last 10 years. It's everywhere now, without subsidies now, because the government decided they didn't like subsidies. And that's how we achieve change. We don't need all governments to act. We only need two big governments to act. In this case, actually, it was a few more because a few European governments then copied the Germans, sometimes not very well. But you get the idea. If we can get strong state action in a few key areas, we don't need unanimity. We don't need 196 countries. We just need a few countries to act in that area. And they trigger the changes that everyone else benefits from. And that's the learning from the last 20 years that we've really got to apply in different areas. Nick and I, we need to think about how it works in land use, Nick. How do we get a couple of countries, just a couple of countries, to tackle this issue substantially? How do we tackle industrial transitions in steel and cement and so on and so on? It's the same idea. And that's why I think it's doable, because it's not that hard. But nowadays, we can probably get 2, 3, 4 big countries to agree on something in a way we'll never get 20 countries to agree. Even the G7 was skewered by 1 or 2 countries not willing to fully agree on something. We don't need it. We don't need it.
Thank you, Sean. So there is another question about which asset owners and particularly pension funds are having the most effective impact on mitigating the worst outcomes of climate change. And just a bit variation to the question, what type of asset owners do you think play the biggest role in this area? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about asset owners, and particularly, let's say we're talking about pension funds, you can also think about insurance companies. Let's talk about pension funds. In a sense, is that they have a very clear focus in terms of their beneficiaries, the workers who've been working for that company or that local authority. And essentially, they don't have that same short-term or maybe sort of profit maximization that, let's say, asset managers do. So who are some of the asset owners, pension funds that are really making a difference? I think we look at some of the US state pension funds, CalPERS, CalSTRS, and particularly in terms of the way that they've been, again, seeding some of the shift to green assets, in terms of leading on the shareholder engagement with the big fossil fuel companies, and crucially, actually moving the market. So the people who were behind this Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a 50 trillion shareholder coalition around the high carbon companies, that was stimulated by one of these Californian state pension funds. So we see that the same in Japan and so on. And the great thing about the asset owners is that the asset managers want to manage their money. So I think setting the bar high, making clear the expectations, seeding some of the early actions, and then making these coalitions work, and importantly, signaling to governments about the rules of the game you need to see, whether that's carbon pricing, renewable incentives, or regulation. So I think really the asset owner piece, and we've seen that with Net Zero, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance. So I think maybe some of the US state funds have been very good, and some of the European ones as well.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, Nick's right. That's good. There are a lot of asset owners, but note the term asset owners. It's not fund managers that drive this. They're responding now. They're doing good work, but it is the holders of the reins of long-term capital, pension funds, insurance funds, that have driven this and are driving this when it comes to the buy side, the investment side. And we need to support them. We need to give them ways to achieve assets and liabilities matching so they can pay your pension suffer when you retire in 50 odd years, whilst meeting their short-term requirements as well. And they can do that. And of course, the understanding that is driving asset owners is that they can't match assets and liabilities in a world of extreme climate change. It's too volatile. They will be legally negligent if they don't find some way to address long-term risk, because the long-term risk will destroy property, destroy portfolios. And that's really the underlying argument here that is working. And they're responding.
And could, I mean, one thing maybe to people in the audience and back again, I used to be working as a fund manager for pension funds and also for individuals. And one thing, please remember the huge action of writing to your fund manager or your pension fund and actually signaling that you need your funds, it's your money being managed in accordance with climate change and sustainable development. So I think in terms of actions, I think there is often a separation in people's minds between their sort of their normal life and their funds, but actually it has huge impact. And that was certainly in terms of when I was engaging with companies on my climate practice. If I could say that my investors in my funds actually want this, it gives a huge boost to your sort of negotiating power. So just as an action, if you have a pension fund, if you do have savings, do signal very clearly your expectations, because that has a actually far greater impact on behavior than you would think.
Thank you to the both of you. Given the time, I think we'll have to wrap up the event. Thank you for everyone who joined today. This is the last event of the term, but we'll have more during the summer, hopefully. Please make sure to look at our other videos. We make very different kind of content. So yeah, thank you so much and take care. I'll stop the live stream now.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks very much.